Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session, Pioneering Our Understanding of the Human Brain. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Nader Pouratian and Dr. Ashley Feinsinger, who will be co-presenting today's talk entitled Invasive Human Neurophysiological Recordings for Basic Science. Is altruism enough? Dr. Pouratian is an associate professor of neurosurgery and radiation oncology and affiliated faculty in bioengineering and neuroscience at UCLA. Dr. Feinsinger is an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Medicine and Department of Philosophy at UCLA and has unique expertise in issues at the intersection of ethics, medicine, and biomedical research. For a complete biography of our speakers, please visit the Biography tab at the top of your screen. My name is Dr. Roshanak Hashemian, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. We would like to extend our special thanks to the Brain Initiative Program Directors, in particular Dr. James Nat, for their efforts in organizing today's session. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting questions during the presentation. Simply click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions in the drop-down box. Following this presentation, we will be offering a unique opportunity to directly discuss the ethical considerations of using new neurotechnologies in a live panel Q&A, which will take place today at 11:20 a.m. Pacific Time and 2:20 p.m. Eastern Time. Any questions that we don't have time to address to our speakers will be answered following the presentation via email. The presentation is educational and thus offers free continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located at the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nader Pouratian and Dr. Ashley Feinsinger.
Hi, I'm Nader Pouratian, neurosurgeon at UCLA, here with Ashley Feinsinger in our Department of Philosophy at UCLA. We're going to be speaking to you about invasive human neurophysiological recordings for basic science. Is altruism enough? Our discussion is going to be focusing on ethical issues that have been raised by some of the studies that we've done in humans. Here's an outline of our talk. I'm going to first start with a description of the landscape of clinical trials with respect to therapeutic intent, which will frame the rest of our discussion, and give some specific examples from NIH and brain-funded research programs that have brought to light the ethical issues, particularly related to altruism. Finally, I'm going to hand it over to Ashley to talk about altruism as a golden motive and some of the issues that we have learned about with respect to considering altruism, and then we'll tie it back to real-life applications. So as I think about the spectrum of clinical trials that we can do in humans, we traditionally think about therapeutic clinical trials where someone would enroll in a study with some kind of anticipation that they may benefit if the item being investigated is intended for therapeutic intent. That would potentially help the individual, help the group of patients that they're in. For example, a Parkinson's disease patient would potentially add to the knowledge for patients with Parkinson's disease, as well as help society in general. But there are, when we get to basic science and translational studies, studies where there is no therapeutic intent, meaning that by participating in these studies, individuals may not benefit directly, but we may learn something about patients with Parkinson's disease. And of course, any kind of knowledge gained is a benefit to society. But we can go one step removed even further, where there are patients who can participate in a clinical trial, and as it may be an invasive study, as we're going to talk about, where there's no intent of helping the individual patient and no intent of even increasing our knowledge, for example, of patients with Parkinson's disease, but just trying to understand how the brain works. I'm going to give you some examples of these so that we can better understand the ethical issues that arise. I'm going to start with these human clinical trials to understand disease. So one example from my laboratory and several other labs is this idea of using neurosurgical procedures to learn about the very diseases that we're treating. In my practice, I implant deep brain stimulator leads in patients with Parkinson's disease. The patients are often awake during these surgeries, and that gives us a very unique opportunity to understand the physiology of Parkinson's. So in addition to the leads that I may place deep within the brain, I will temporarily place an electrocardiographic strip on top of the brain. That's something we wouldn't normally do for therapeutic purposes. It's purely for research purposes. And we can use some advanced image registration algorithms to figure out where those electrodes are. And now we can study physiology from multiple points in the brain to gain a better understanding of how Parkinson's disease actually affects the brain. So, for example, this is one of our reports in which we record signals from deep within the brain, from the globus pallidus internus, signified by GPI there on the left side of the slide. And you can see a demonstration of what we call phase amplitude coupling in the rest phase, and that goes away with movement. And if you look just to the right of that, there's a GPE rest, which looks different than the GPI and GPI movement. So we get these dynamic pictures of what is going on in the physiology of the brain. More importantly, on the right side of the slide, we see that those signals that are depicted on the left side actually have clinical correlates. So we see that this PAC, or the phase amplitude coupling, correlates with symptom severity, both with regards to a measure that we call UPDRS, but then also rigidity and bradykinesia. And we could see how much those signals change with movement. So what we've really identified here by studying patients with Parkinson's disease is a biomarker of symptom severity. And you can imagine that although the people who participate in these studies don't benefit from this, we've learned something about Parkinson's disease, and hopefully we can use this to help other people with Parkinson's disease in the future, perhaps designing a more advanced deep brain stimulation system. One other example here, we showed that we can gain insights into how deep brain stimulation works, that it disrupts network synchrony. And we show here that with the DBS off, there's a high level of network synchrony, and that when we turn the deep brain stimulator on, that high beta synchrony, the coupling between the motor cortex and the globus pallidus, actually decreases. So again, the people who participate in the study don't get any therapeutic benefit from having participated, but we've learned something, and we can hopefully help other people with Parkinson's disease in the future from what we've learned. But we can go one step removed. A lot of these patients that I operate on, we will conduct studies not to understand Parkinson's disease, but to understand how the brain itself works. This is another study that I work on, multi-institutional, where we're trying to understand parallel circuits between the cortex and deep within the brain, the basal ganglia, and how they work to regulate movements under conditions where you need to select an action, where there's conflicting actions, or when you need to stop an action. None of this has to do with Parkinson's disease, but they're very fundamental questions of human neuroscience. And doing these in patients who are undergoing deep brain stimulation provides a very unique opportunity. Here's just some examples where we see that, for example, in the middle column under STN, you see that there is a signal in the theta range that's increased during periods of conflict. We also see that there's a signal that emerges during conflict in the pre-SMA, where we record from the cortex in these patients as well. And this is helping us understand the circuits that mitigate conflict when making motor decisions. Again, these are fundamental questions and things that we want to learn about the brain, and things that we can only learn from patients who are undergoing neurosurgical procedures, because we don't have that ability in other volunteers. Now, how did the ethical issues come to light? You know, I've been doing this type of research for a little while, and another center who was involved in the study has been doing it. And we went to submit these to our IRB, and we had no problems at all. The third site was new to doing this type of work, and the IRB raised concerns that there could be therapeutic misconception. And my immediate retort was, but you know, when we do this, patients say they want to give back. And for me, that was great justification. I said, you know, if they want to give back, why should we get in their way? The question comes to light, which is, you know, is this actually true and sufficient to justify their involvement? Is altruism and their desire to give back a sufficient motivation? Put another way, you know, we often focus on therapeutic misconception, but assuming therapeutic misconception is completely accounted for, then that means we are completely relying on altruistic intent, meaning patients have no therapeutic expectation, but then they must want to be altruistic. And this issue of whether altruism is sufficient and whether it can be complicated by any other factors is even more important in those studies where there is no direct benefit either to the patient or to their group. And so it becomes exponentially more important to explore. So I'm going to hand this over to Ashley to discuss that a bit further.
Great. So given the clinical context that Nader has set up for us, we are faced with a fairly robust question, right? So does altruism actually affect the ethics of non-therapeutic invasive human neuroscience research? And I think, also as Nader alluded to, there is an assumption either implicit in the ways that our ethical principles are stated or in our everyday practice that altruism is a kind of golden motive. And I think that this assumption is probably the conjunction of two different assumptions, right? So the first assumption is that the presence of altruistic motives, say on the part of these participants, is always an ethical positive. So whenever we see it, it's kind of a good thing. And the second assumption I think we have is that reports of altruistic motives are always uncomplicated, that we can fairly easily and reliably tell when it is that patients actually have altruistic motives. So in the rest of the talk, what I'll do is I'll try to unpack these assumptions, and I'll give some arguments for how it could be that altruism does affect the ethics of these trials, both positively and perhaps negatively, or give us pause for concern. And I'll say some things at the end about some epistemic worries about how do we tell when people are truly altruistic, and some practical concerns about what we ought to do moving forward to make progress on these issues. So the first and most straightforward way in which altruism may affect the ethics of these non-therapeutic trials is in promoting informed consent. So our doctrine of informed consent requires that participants' consent be informed, right? So not based on a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of the risks, benefits, or alternatives in the trial. And it must also be voluntary or free from coercion or other undue influences. So in the case of therapeutic research, if we look at the chart on the left of the slide, we can ask a question, right? So we can say, why would patients agree to incur additional risk by enrolling in the trial? And there's a fairly obvious or reasonable answer that makes informed consent possible, right? So it could be very reasonable for someone to take on additional risk to their health for the possibility of therapeutic benefit, even if that possibility is small, right? And in many cases, enrolling in these types of trials is in fact in the best clinical interest of those participants. But if we focus on the non-therapeutic case, so the chart on the right, we don't have available that same kind of answer because, of course, there currently is no direct therapeutic benefit for those participants. So we might feel like we're in a bit of a puzzle, right? So we need to get informed free consent. So we're looking for a reason for enrolling in these trials that could be informed and free, but we can't use the same reason we used for the therapeutic cases. So we might start to wonder whether there is a reason that could be reasonably informed and free. And it has been suggested that the presence of altruistic motives could provide such a reason. So we know that patients may participate or agree to enroll in trials for all kinds of reasons, right? So it might be that participants actually are agreeing to enroll in non-therapeutic trials because they mistakenly believe that the trial is therapeutic. That could be a reason. Or they could enroll because they have feelings of debt to their surgeon. They feel like they can't say no. But notice that those reasons are ethically concerning, right? It would raise some red flags about the possibility of informed and free consent. But altruism, on the other hand, and the presence of an altruistic motive, at least at first glance, doesn't have those same kinds of problems, right? So the participant says, look, I know I won't benefit and I know my condition will not improve, but I want to help society and I care very much about helping scientists understand the brain. That kind of reason, right, actually looks like it's based on a proper understanding of the goals of the trial and doesn't yet on its own give us cause for concern about coercion and undue influence. So the next way in which altruism may affect the ethics of these types of trials is in talking about the risk-benefit assessments of these trials. So one of our other pillars of research ethics is that the risks be reasonable in relation to the benefits, right? So the federal common rule requires IRBs to determine that risks are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, if any, to subjects, and the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be expected to result. So IRB committees ask for an explicit delineation, right, of the risks of the trial, benefits to the individual, benefits to society, and a risk-benefit analysis. But in the case of non-therapeutic invasive neurologic research, the mouthful, right, applying this rule is particularly difficult, right, for a few reasons. So the first is that the relative rarity of the investigative techniques that are used in these types of trials can result in a kind of uncertainty about what the actual risks are. And that fact, compounded with the fact that harm to the brain, right, or neurological harm may be more consequential than harm to other organs, can give us pause for concern, right? So we have some challenges here in really being able to delineate the risks of a trial in a meaningful way. On the benefit side of things, we might ask, how are we supposed to appropriately value, say, a piece of scientific knowledge? How much weight do we give that benefit, right? Or an expected increase in knowledge about some particular part of the brain, right? How do we value that? And there's also questions about what ought to count as a benefit, right? So currently, as the federal common rule states, we're only really considering direct therapeutic benefits to the participant or else benefits to society. But it is kind of an open question whether there are other types of benefits we ought to consider, and I'll return to that shortly. The last challenge, which I'll just mention briefly, is that we have to then work out what a reasonable ratio would be. And in the case of non-therapeutic studies, we're trying to balance personal risk with benefit to society. And it's not at all clear what would actually count as a reasonable ratio. How much risk, personal risk, is actually reasonable in relation to how much knowledge about the brain. I'll add that currently, when there's no direct benefit to the individual, right, the only other benefit that we consider in conducting this assessment is benefit to society. And given that there's quite a lot of non-therapeutic research happening, that implicitly suggests that in many cases, the benefits to society are sufficient to outweigh the risk. But it's worth pausing to ask yourself, whether that's justified or on what grounds is that actually true. So to kind of tie that into our case about altruism, it has also been argued that altruism may count as a kind of benefit to the participants in the trial. So it may be that being able to pursue your goals that you care about, or your altruistic goals, may contribute to an increase in your well-being, in your overall well-being, right? And it may very well be that an increase in your well-being ought to count as a kind of benefit in these types of assessments. So just as being able to donate money to a cause that you care deeply about might plausibly increase your quality of life or your sense of well-being, being able to participate in the trial whose goal you care deeply about may also contribute to your well-being. So, it's an open question. I won't argue whether, in fact, we should count altruism as a benefit, but it's an open question, and we're already using these concepts in our ethical assessments, and it's worth pausing to consider whether altruism ought to count. It's also worth noting that in clinical medicine, right, we care about more than simply survival, right? We also care about quality of life, and it's plausible that an increase in well-being is intimately connected to an increase in your quality of life. It's worth pausing also to reflect on, what we have to face if we don't count altruism as a kind of benefit on that risk-benefit scale, right? Without altruism or without any direct benefit, in our best case scenarios, the risk-benefit assessment in non-therapeutic research is, I would say, ethically concerning, right? How is it permissible to allow someone to take all of the risk for zero benefit is really the situation we're facing. And the standard answer to this is to appeal back to consent. Look, we allow people to consent to minimal risk with no benefit because we value autonomy, right, is one of the explanations that's given. But notice that this explanation doesn't say that the risk-benefit ratio in these cases is reasonable. In fact, it just explains the ratio or justifies the ratio by appealing back to consent. So notice that if altruism were to count as a kind of benefit, it would be a way to kind of add to the benefit and change that risk-benefit ratio directly. So that might be a kind of ethical positive for us. So far, it might start to seem like I'm building a case for altruism, in fact, being a golden motive, right? Maybe it helps with informed consent. Maybe it helps promote beneficence towards the participants themselves. But I would just, for the last part of the talk, pause to remind ourselves that the presence of altruistic motives, while maybe it's promising in these other areas, does not absolve us of all of our robust ethical concerns. And one concern that I'll talk about briefly is exploitation, right? So this is another pillar of research ethics, to protect research participants from exploitation. And we can see it surface here in this quote from Emmanuel, Wendler, and Grady. I'll just read the first part of it. The overarching objective of clinical research is to develop generalizable understanding of human biology. Subjects who participate are the means to securing such knowledge. By placing some people at risk of harm for the good of others, clinical research has the potential for exploitation of human subjects. So exploitation is commonly taken to be taking unfair advantage of a person's vulnerability for the sake of advancing one's own end. And the point here is pretty simple, right? So the presence of altruistic motives just does not, on its own, preclude the possibility of being exploited. So we still have a lot of work to do, regardless of how the first part of this talk turns out. And the point is simply that norms about exploitation do not reduce to norms about informed consent or norms about a favorable risk-benefit ratio, especially in the non-therapeutic case. And that's just a kind of a complicated way of saying that you can be exploited or treated unfairly in enrolling in a trial, even when you consent to that treatment, right? And you can be exploited or treated unfairly in enrolling in a trial, even if the risks to you are reasonable in relation to the benefits to society, right? I would add that if altruism does count as a benefit that we should take into account for these trials, then maybe that is helping a little bit with exploitation, because then in these cases, the participant is getting something, a direct benefit in some way, but it still doesn't absolve us of all of our worries for the following reasons. And the first is this. So it's plausible that there are ethical limits to altruistic sacrifice, right? And that not all such sacrifice is reasonable. And so then if this is so, taking advantage of someone's willingness to make those sacrifices may be wrong. It's also possible that altruistic behavior may stem from feelings of self-loathing and self-worth. And so taking advantage of someone's willingness to make those sacrifices may also be wrong. Now, this can kind of compound with the fact that participant populations in these cases are already highly vulnerable, suffering from debilitating neurological disorders, and many are also socially isolated. So now that we've walked through some of the ethical issues, I'd like to end with some practical concerns. The first are some epistemic worries, right? That we don't have well-developed tools for assessing altruistic motivation. So even when patients report altruistic motivations, we don't currently know how to assess those in light of some of the other worries about vulnerability and exploitation. And we also know that there are many factors that may influence patients reporting altruistic motives, such as the belief that they will be more likely to be accepted into the trial if they report being altruistic, or the belief that they ought to be altruistic. So we have some worries here about being able to really tell when it is that patients are altruistic. And given the ethics, it really seems to matter that we get it right. So now I'll turn it over to Nader to talk about some practical issues.
So as we design studies in the future, we have to both be aware of these concerns about altruism, but also learn more about it. So future studies should really impact our understanding of how participation changes a subject's sense of well-being, as well as their sense of value to society. We need to really reflect as well on our consent process and how it enables or might complicate our understanding of patients' altruistic motives. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Pouratian and Dr. Feinsinger, for that compelling presentation. Please remember to submit your questions for Dr. Pouratian and Dr. Feinsinger, who will answer them in the live panel Q&A taking place today at 11:20 a.m. Pacific Time, 2:20 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join us for this unique opportunity to interact directly with our renowned experts to discuss neuroethics and the ethical considerations of using new neurotechnologies. We hope to see you there. Coming up next, Dr. Francis Shen will continue the neuroethics track and present From Lab to Law, Neuroscience in the Courtroom.